All right. Thank you everyone for joining. I want to wish you a Chag Kosher Sameach in advance. It should be a smooth and clear, meaningful job of preparing for Pesach, which is so important. And to introduce tonight's topic, we're talking about koshering the kitchen for Pesach. And I want to reiterate what I mentioned in last week's class, which is that there's a world of a difference between areas of the house that interact with our Pesach food and areas of the house that do not interact with our Pesach food. Areas of the house that do not interact with our Pesach food, it's pretty simple and pretty easy. Some of us go a little over the top, but honestly, all you really need to do is check and make sure that there's no significant chametz anywhere, no whole pretzels or actual pieces. The fact there's dust and lint and it's not super clean is really not an issue. But as soon as we get into the kitchen, all of a sudden everything changes. Because now we're dealing with our Pesach food. And when we're dealing with our Pesach food, then all of a sudden dust and crumbs are an issue. Because we cannot have chametz crumbs going into our Pesach food on Pesach. So what are you supposed to do about that? So we need to kosher all those surfaces. And we need to be 100% sure that we're not going to have any crumbs of chametz falling into our food. Now, by way of introduction, there are a couple different ways of koshering. The idea of koshering is to address something called blios. Blios are referring to flavor that was absorbed into some type of a material. So let's say my metal pot absorb some degree of flavor from the noodles that are cooked in it during the year. And then if I were to cook soup in that same pot without koshering it, so some of the flavor of those chametz noodles will go into my soup, and then it'll make it a chametz dika soup, and it'll make it non-kosher for Passover. That's what we're dealing with tonight. Now, how do I kosher something that was used for either non-kosher food or for chametz, and I want to kosher it for Pesach? So there's a couple of ways. There's essentially two primary ways, which is boiling water and fire. Now, when I say fire, I don't mean flames. You don't necessarily need flames. What I mean is intense heat. So when it comes to libun, which is koshering with fire, there's 2 degrees of libun. There's what's called libun kal, which is a lighter duty koshering, where you expose it to that heat enough that the item becomes hot enough that if you touch paper to it, it would singe. That's the lower level. The higher level is where it's actually glowing red hot, which is a very, very high temperature. But that's the most powerful way to kosher anything. And we'll discuss that when we get to our ovens. The other approach, which is the most popular, is called hagala, which is to dip something in boiling hot water. And then there's something called irui, which means pouring, which is the same idea as hagala, as dipping in boiling hot water, but instead of dipping it in a pot of boiling hot water, you're pouring the boiling hot water onto the item. Now, there are 2 more points of introduction. One is that a general rule when dealing with koshering is kibolo kachpolte. The way it went in is how it comes out. So depending on how the utensil is used when cooking or when serving, that will determine the way that it needs to be koshered. So for example, if I were to take a pot in which I boil noodles, I need to kosher that pot by putting it into boiling water. If I have a grill on which the food is directly touching the grill, which is getting hot with fire, so then I need to kosher that grill with fire. I can't dip it in boiling water. That will not be sufficient. One last very important detail is not all materials are created equal. There is a concept in the Gemara of a kli cheres, of an earthenware vessel, which will absorb non-kosher flavor and can never be koshered. And there are different types of materials that enter into the question of whether they're considered a kli cheres, a ceramic. Porcelain sinks, for example, we do not kasher for that exact reason, because porcelain is considered a kli cheres, is considered ceramic. China is a similar story. We do not typically kasher China because we treat that as kli cheres. There are other materials which are less clear, such as plastics, and different opinions regarding plastics. As a general rule, Passover, we're a little bit stricter than we are the rest of the year, and many poskim will recommend not kashering plastics for Pesach. If someone is in a tough situation, there's what to rely upon, and they should talk to their rabbi. And that being the case, it's important also to recognize that a lot of what we're going to talk about is not, you have to be practical. And what I mean by that is that some of what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of how to kasher, it's not so easy to do it right. And in many scenarios, you might be better off avoiding kashering altogether. And we'll discuss ways that you can do that. Obviously, purchasing Passover tools and having your Passover pots and your Passover pans and your Passover forks and spoons, that solves that problem. And many people do have that practice. And it just saves a lot of work. Now, this is a somewhat new approach to Passover, because if you take a look at earlier halachic writings, it's clear that the common practice was to kasher everything every Passover. And it makes sense because certainly in European Jewry pre-World War II, your average Jew was relatively was relatively poor, and the idea of having an additional set of pots and pans and cutlery was unheard of. But today, with the affluence of American Jewry, for certainly, but international Jewry as well, it has become much more practical to have your Passover tools. And also, things are less expensive than they used to be. And to get an inexpensive set of pots and pans is not really such a big deal. Okay, so that being said, let's get down to it. So let's start in the kitchen. And in our kitchen, we have counters, we have sinks, we have a stovetop, we have an oven, and we have cabinets. We have a fridge and we have a freezer. So let's start with our counters. Something that we're always going to do is we're always going to clean everything well. And here, when I say clean well, this means more than just a simple sweep like the rest of the house. With your counters, you want to spray them down and you really want to scrub them and make sure that there's no residue or anything of that nature left behind. Now, some counters can be kashered. That's typically your stone counters. Formica cannot be kashered. Certainly, metal counters can be kashered. Wood counters can also be kashered. It's uncommon, but a butcher block does exist, and it's actually because it has become popular to get butcher block, and that can be kasher. Now, the way you would kasher a counter would be to pour boiling water on it, and I'll get into the details of that when we deal with the sinks, and it's going to be the exact same rules. But in general, it's not necessary. Even if you have a material which can be kashered, like a stone, such as granite, it's still not necessarily a good idea, because as you'll see when we discuss the sinks, it's not so easy to do it right, to kasher your counter with pouring boiling water over it. You may not do it right. You may hurt yourself pouring boiling water all over the place and make a mess. And it's a big job. It's likely that it's not worth it. And I would recommend that you explore the possibility of simply covering your counters. And I know it's a hard thing to do. A lot of people cringe when they hear this, especially after investing all that money in beautiful granite countertops. But you really might save yourself a very big headache. And after all, Pesach is only 1 week, and to cover your counters for 1 week might be well worth it. Some people invest in their counter covers, and they make themselves covers that they can put away and store and bring out every year. I don't know if you want to go to that extreme. Any cover is sufficient. You don't need it to be particularly thick, but you do want it to be thick enough that you'll be confident that it's not going to tear. To simply put your average aluminum foil over your counters may not be a smart idea, because you'll put your pot down and slide it a little bit and it'll rip, and now your chometz dika counter is exposed on Pesach and everyone's all concerned. You have to call the rabbi, and maybe I spilled something, maybe I didn't, maybe I trafed up my Passover pots. What am I going to do? You really want to avoid that scenario, and it's not so hard to do. In Israel, they make this like bulletproof aluminum foil. It's not so easy to find in America. What I recommend is contact paper. That stuff is really strong, and they make different types of contact paper that are designed specifically to cover your counters, and some of them actually look really nice. Then they have patterns on them, and they have an adhesive back to it, and it really works very well. And that's a really good option. But you're not limited to that. Whatever material you can come up with, which is not going to tear and will stay in place, is really perfectly fine. Once your counters are completely clean, and then you cover them, you can put down your hot Passover pots, and you don't have to be worried about the fact that, oh no, it's hot and it's touching the surface, and it's covered by something so thin, and underneath that is a counter which has all types of chometz things absorbed into it, and heat draws out that flavor, etc., etc. It's not a problem at all. I'm not going to get into the details of why that is, but the fact that there is a barrier and there's no liquid medium between the barriers, between the counter and the barrier, that prevents any transfer of any flavor. And you can go ahead and put your hot pots and pans directly down on top of that covered counter with no concern at all. Okay, moving through the kitchen, the fridge and the freezer, really all that needs to happen is you got to really clean it really, really well. And it could be a time-consuming job, especially those lips around the gaskets, around the doors. You got to get in there with a toothbrush and really, really do it right. That could be a big job, because this is where you're keeping your Passover food. So we really want to be extra careful that there's no chametz at all, no crumbs, no residue, no nothing. So you really got to scrub that clean. And all the surfaces inside the fridge and the freezer are the same story. You really got to scrub it clean and take everything out and do that. And then your fridge is really, once it's 100, if it's 100% clean, it's kosher for Passover, you're good. Many people have accustomed to cover the shelves in the fridge. There really is not a halachic requirement for that. People have this like mentality that I'm going to take my kosher for Passover ketchup and my kosher for Passover mayonnaise, and I'm going to put it in my fridge right on top of the shelf that had a piece of challah on it yesterday. Like, you tell them that and their head's about ready to explode. There's really nothing wrong with that, because once you scrub it clean and there's no crumbs left, if it's a cold surface and you're putting something down there, really nothing to worry about. Nonetheless, many people do have accustomed to cover all those surfaces, and it is an extra layer of precaution. And if you have that custom, no worries, go ahead and do that. Or if you're, concerned that, I scrubbed it, but maybe I didn't do a perfectly good job, and you really want to be 110% sure, go ahead and cover those surfaces and go into Passover worry-free. So that's that's your story with your fridge and freezer. Regarding your freezer, those plastic ice trays you fill up with water and you put them in, and etc. Good idea to get a new set of those for Pesach. They're not expensive, and if they're out and they're being used with chametz and this and that, and it's worth it to just get a fresh set. Technically speaking, if you really scrub them out clean, you don't have to worry about that either. But it's worth it if it's not expensive. If you're going to cover your shelves in your fridge, make sure you are not blocking the airflow. That's just a practical point. Okay, now we're done with our counters and our fridge and our freezer. Now we're moving on to the cabinets. Many of us are going to be keeping our chametz pots and pans in our kitchen cabinets over Passover, and we're going to lock them up and we're going to tape them up, and we're going to say not for Passover. Those cabinets do not need to be cleaned at all. You just lock them up, you tape them shut, you make it clear that it's not for Passover, you make it clear, you make sure that nobody's going to accidentally open it up over Passover, and all those cabinets you can forget about. Some people do that to all their cabinets, and they'll put up one of those plastic cabinets in their kitchen or their dining room. That's what they'll use for their handful of Passover pots and dry goods. That's an easy solution if you want to go that route. If you're going to use some of your cabinets for Passover, and you want to just kind of consolidate your chametz stuff to half of your cabinets and tape those up, and the other half you're going to use on Passover, nothing wrong with doing that. And then you clean that out similar to your fridge. So you want to clean it out really well. If there's any residue anywhere, you want to scrub it. You want to make sure there's no crumbs anywhere, and you really want it to be spotless. And again, many have the practice to cover all those shelves as well. And that is, again, a chumrah. It's a nice thing. If you have that minhag, go ahead and continue it. Or if you want that extra bit of protection, go ahead and do that. But again, not absolutely required. And once it's spotless and crumb-free, you're good to go. Dining room table is a similar story. You want to scrub it clean. With the dining room table, it's really recommended to cover it with some type of a thick covering. A thick plastic tablecloth is a great example. Something that's not going to tear. And you keep it on there the whole Passover. I'll even tape it up a little bit so that it won't come off. And then you just put your kosher for Passover tablecloth on top of that, and then you're good to go for Pesach. For those of us who have little children sitting in high chairs or booster seats, that's a big job because you really got to do the same thing. You got to scrub it clean and get all the residue and all the crumbs out of all the crevices. And then you got to cover that tray and make sure that if you're putting the Passover food directly on there, it's not enough to just clean it. That you really do have to cover, and you have to cover with something that the baby's not going to pull off and they're not going to tear it. So that if you want to do that, that's how you do it. You clean it really, really well, and then the tray on top of getting cleaned really well has got to get covered with something that's going to stay on for the duration of Passover, and then you're good to go. You could do that. Many people find that is a really hard job to do, especially covering the tray such that the baby's not going to rip off that cover or not going to tear it over Passover is for many not practical. So some people will get an extra tray and they'll just have a Passover tray and they'll write on a marker, for Passover, they'll put it away with the Passover pots, or they'll get an entirely separate Passover high chair for a Passover booster seat. Again, you don't want to go broke buying extra stuff for Passover. So if you don't have it yet, build up little by little, year by year, get one new thing each year until you've got everything you want. And in the meantime, cover everything, scrub everything, and do what you got to do. But that's the story with a high chair. Now, how about hand towels and bibs? Hand towels and bibs have got to be clean. They can't have any stuff stuck in them, of course. But if you're worried about what might be absorbed in them, all you got to do is put it through the laundry in the washing machine on hot with some detergent, and you're good to go. A lot of people have a practice of having separate hand towels and of cloth bibs for Passover. Again, not absolutely required, but a very nice idea, something that I would recommend. One last thing. Talking about hand towels in our hands. Women who wear rings, if it's more than a simple ring, if it's a diamond engagement ring, it is proper to get that cleaned for Passover. Certainly, if you're getting it professionally cleaned, it doesn't get better than that. And hey, it'll have a little extra sparkle for Yom Tov, so that's a nice thing. Many of us might not have the time for that. So just give it a good clean and take a careful look at it and make sure it's good to go. If you're going to wear it on Passover, then that's what you should do there. Okay, so now we're ready to get into the sink, the oven, and the stovetop. And this is where the real koshering takes place. So the sink is used throughout the year with hot food. We're pouring hot food from our pots and pans into the sink all the time. And you can certainly have hot chametz go into your sink and get absorbed into the walls of the sink. So you really got to kosher that sink if you want to use it on Passover. Now, if you want to avoid koshering your sink, or you have a sink that you can't kosher because it's made out of enamel, as we mentioned, or porcelain, you really do have that option. And all you've got to do is clean it really, really well. And if you can cover it with something like a contact paper or a foil, and do it in a good enough job that it's not going to tear and not going to get exposed over Passover, you could really do that. And you're good to go. And you don't have to bother koshering that sink at all. However, or you could use a kosher, you could have an insert, sink insert, kosher for Passover insert, and you could do that. Now, if you're going to use an insert, the only word of caution I'm going to warn you about is that you got to make sure that the water doesn't back up into your Passover utensils into the insert. So if your sink drains a little bit slowly and you didn't kosher it and you're using hot water and it backs up into your insert, that could get tricky and that could turn into a nightmare. So you do want to be cautious to avoid that scenario if you're going to take that road. Okay, now if you want to kosher your sink and you've got a stainless steel sink, which is certainly a material which can be kosher for Passover, you're going to kosher it the way that it absorbed that chametz. So how did it absorb it? Well, you didn't cook anything in the sink itself. What you did is you poured from your pots and pans into the sink. So you're going to kosher by pouring hot water. Now, what you have to do first is you got to clean it 100%. There can't be any residue left on that sink. And you really got to scrub it. You might need some steel wool, and a word of caution, steel wool will scratch stainless steel surfaces. So you might want to do what you need to do to avoid that, damaging your sink. And then once you get every last bit of residue off that sink, then you've got to let it sit for 24 hours. Now this 24 hours business is only necessary when you're dealing with koshering with boiling water, either by inserting into a pot of boiling water or pouring boiling water. So if you're going to use this method for your counters, you're going to have to let your counters sit for 24 hours as well. Now, when I say let them sit, that doesn't mean you can't put anything on them and you can't even wash your hands. And you can't use any hot liquid. Hot liquid cannot touch that sink or those counters for 24 hours. That's what I mean. A really smart thing you can do, which I highly recommend, is crawl under that sink and turn off the hot water valve. Now you're safe. You don't have to worry about messing up and accidentally turning on the hot water. Oh my gosh, now I gotta wait 24 hours all over again. That's a very smart idea. Another smart idea, I got this one actually from Mrs. Woodman. She said, kasher your sinks after Shabbos. Because guess what? We're not allowed to use hot water on Shabbos. So you've got yourself a built-in 24 hours of that sink not being used with hot water. Now you've got to be careful not to pour anything hot in that sink on Shabbos. So if you drink coffee on Shabbos and you got an urn, or you've got your cholent pot or whatever it is, your soup, you got to be careful not to do that. But you at least have yourself a 24-hour window where you're not going to be using the hot tap. So that's the other thing. Now the idea, just to give you just a drop of what's going on here, the idea of 24 hours is anything absorbed into a vessel that sits for 24 hours, the absorbed flavors kind of lose their they lose their benefit, or they are negatively impacted. They become stale by sitting for 24 hours, and therefore it becomes easier to kasher them. So that's what you do. You after you're done scrubbing your sink clean, you let it sit for 24 hours without any hot liquid touching it. And then after it sits for 24 hours, then you take your kosher for Passover pot, you boil up some water, and you pour it into that sink. Now it's not that simple because of two things. Number one is it needs to be boiling while you pour it. And as soon as you take a pot of water off the fire, it stops boiling pretty fast. So you've got to work fast, and I recommend using 2 small pots and kind of refilling them and putting them back on the fire and alternating between the 2 of them. That's what I recommend. That's point number 1, which becomes very tricky when you're trying to kasher your sink, and it gets even harder when you're kashering your counters, which is why I was recommending that you try to avoid kashering those counters. The other thing which is tricky is that it's not enough that every surface gets some type of hot water hit it. It's got to get hit by the stream itself. So if you pour hot water at the top of your sink all the way around, and you just let it pour down the sides and then to the drain, it's not good enough. Because by the time the water makes its way down the wall of the sink, or down to the bottom of the sink, it's not getting hit directly by boiling water anymore. Now it's getting hit by a flow of water, which is no longer that same boiling temperature, and it's not getting hit directly from that boiling pot of water, and that is not powerful enough to kasher that sink or to kasher that counter for that matter, and that gets very tricky. So you've really got to kind of pour slowly and work your way out. Some recommend if you've got like a pan, a raised pan, you could put that on your stovetop and boil up the water in there. And then you can kind of pour a long flat stream, and you can hit larger surfaces with that direct pour. So this is a difficult thing to do, which is why some people will try to avoid having to kasher their sink. And as we mentioned, the ways to do that, I certainly recommend trying to avoid kashering your counter this way because of the challenges involved in it. And when it comes to your sink, one more like word to the wise is start where the drain is and work your way out. That would be the way to do it. Because that way you kind of have a better handle on what's getting hit directly by the stream and what's getting hit by water that's draining away from the stream. And that is what I'd recommend doing it. The way to do it, give yourself enough time, give yourself enough refreshed pots, and that's the way that you kasher a sink for Pesach or a countertop if you're going to go that route. Okay, now let's move on with the stovetop. So there's a couple different types of stovetops. There's the gas range, and then there's the electric stovetop. And the electric stovetop has, there's some that have that old-fashioned coils, and then there are some that have the glass top, which has become very popular. There are other stovetops as well, but they're less common, and I'm not going to talk about them tonight. If you have one of those less common examples, feel free to reach me and we'll discuss it. As an aside, just about everything I'm teaching you tonight is printed in the Starcade Passover Guide, and I highly recommend getting your hands on one of these because you can use it as a reference and look back at it as you, if you have any questions and you want to have an easy way to kind of check things out. Okay, so for your stovetop, if you have a gas range, so there's two parts. There's the surface, and then you have the ranges themselves, the little disc on top, and then you've got the grill, the piece that goes over the flames that the pots sit on. So the surface of your range is not really your pots are not sitting directly on that at all. And the only thing that happens there is stuff gets spilled on it. So for that surface, all you've got to do is clean it really well, as we mentioned, getting all the crumbs and all the residue gone, and then you cover it. And here, covering it with foil is not such a terrible idea because you're not putting your pots directly on there. There's much less of a concern of it tearing. Once you got that all covered, then you've got the grill itself and the tops of the range. Those little discs that sit on top of the range, you just take those off and you scrub them really well. You turn on the flame for 5 minutes and it gets real hot and it's kosher. You're done. The grill part where the pot sits on that, so you've got to scrub it really clean 100% and get all that stuff off of it. And then if once you're done with that, you've got two options. You could either turn up the flame real high, but then you have to additionally put something on top of it, cover it with either a sheet of metal or a large pot to spread, or a real thick aluminum foil to spread that flame so that the entire range gets that high heat. And you've got to keep it on there until it gets hot enough that if you touch a piece of paper to it, it would singe it. And then it's kosher, it's done. Now, this technique is a little bit tricky, a little bit dangerous. Number one is don't do all of it at the same time. Do one side and then do the other side, because otherwise the heat just gets too much and you could start a fire very easily, and it's quite dangerous. Another option, which is much less dangerous, is once your oven is completely cleaned, you could stick them in your oven, and certainly if you put the oven on self-clean, which we'll talk about more in a minute, that will kosher them. Or if you turn up your oven to 550 to the highest temperature for 40 or 45 minutes, that also is good enough. You take the racks out and they are kosher for Passover. You put them in their place and they're good to go. Now, something I want to mention before we move on is drying racks. We spoke about the sink. You've got your sink insert. Many sinks have that. If you want to use that for Passover, similar story, scrub it and then pour the boiling water on it. Similar to the sink itself. A lot of people will get separate sink bottom pieces for Passover. Drying racks, I highly recommend you get a separate drying rack for Passover stuff. You're putting your hot Passover pots in there. They're not so expensive. You can get them, the plastic ones, at Walmart. It's worth it to get a separate one for Passover. Okay. One word of warning regarding your koshering your stove top with a gas range is that when you take off those grill, some of them have those little rubber feet on them. And if you stick them in your oven at 550, it could melt, it could damage them. So just be mindful of that and pop them off, pop them back on, or whatever you got to do. Okay. If you have a blech, you should not use your blech for the year for Passover. Get yourself a separate blech for Passover, or figure out ways to manage through the Shabbosim of Passover without a blech. A crock pot is ceramic and cannot be kosher for Passover. So don't get yourself a separate crock pot for Passover. There are some metal crock pots. In theory, you could kosher that with boiling water if it's 100% clean, and then you fill it up and you dip it into boiling water after it sits for 24 hours and follow that process. But again, I don't necessarily recommend it. Those things are really, really hard to get them 100% clean, and you're probably better off just skipping it all together and getting yourself an inexpensive kosher for Passover crock pot that you put away every year. Okay, getting back to our stovetop. Many of us have electric stovetops. If you got the coil top, you're in luck. Those are the easiest ones to kosher. Again, you clean the surface and you cover it with foil. The drip pans are really hard to clean. They're not so expensive to just replace them and get a new set every Passover. It's worth it. But if you want to go that road and you want to scrub it, you certainly can do that. And you scrub them clean, and then you cover them, and you're good to go. The coils themselves, all you've got to do is turn them on high. Once they glow red, they're kosher. You don't have to do anything. If they're smoking, because there's a little bit of residue on them, you got to let them keep smoking until they stop. Once they stop smoking, that's an indication that whatever food residue was on there was completely destroyed, became koshered, and you're good to go. You can use it for Passover. That's it. You're done. Glass stovetops are the hardest. Koshering a glass stovetop is really tricky. And honestly, if you're in the market for a new oven, try to avoid getting one. If you have one, because many of us have them, because it came with the house or whatever, it was a great deal, whatever it was, you didn't realize, don't worry about it, but this is what you got to do. You got to scrub it clean. That's always what you got to do. And you'll turn each of the burners onto the highest heat until it glows red. And once it's glowing red for a few minutes, that circle is kosher. Now the problem is that only the circle that was glowing red got kosher. The rest of the glass top did not get kosher. And if you do want to kosher the rest of the glass, you've got to get it up to that temperature. The problem is, how are you going to do that? Well, you could use a blowtorch, or you could cover it with a sheet of metal and spread the heat, or something like that. Problem is that the manufacturer warns you never do that, because if you do that, you're running the risk of shattering the glass and destroying your entire stovetop. So now that you're not going to do that, now you're stuck, because a portion of your glass top is not kosher. Now, normally that's not such a huge deal because you'll just cover it with some tin foil. Problem is, with a glass cooktop, it's one continuous piece of glass. So if I cover parts of it with foil and then I put a pot on there and my kosher Passover pot starts to boil over, and now I've got boiling water spreading all over my glass top, and some of it has foil, it starts going under the foil, and it's on the part that got koshered, on the part that didn't get koshered, under the foil, and then that boiling water that touched the non-kosher for Passover section, then it's touching my kosher for Passover pot. It's a nightmare. So what are you going to do? Another problem. If I have a kosher for Passover pot that's too big, it doesn't fit on the spot where the burner is. Now what? So this is There's no great answer for any of these questions. So one approach is scrub the whole thing clean, kasher the burners, like we said, turn them all the way up, and then you elevate your pots. So they actually sell these mats that are specially designed for these glass top things. And you can put it over the burner and put your pot directly on top of that. That's one solution. Because once it's elevated, then you don't have to worry about the pot being too big because it's not touching the glass anyways. And you don't have to worry about a little bit of a drip or a spill because that spill is not going to come in contact with your pot anyways. If you can't get your hands on one of those mats, you can take a disc, a metal disc. You want it to be at least 1/8 of an inch thick. So there's an actual elevation where a spill is not going to make contact between the cooktop and the pot. And then you're good. That's another option. There's this other thing that they have called a heat diffuser that you put on the glass cooktop around the range. I don't really know exactly what that thing is, but that also could potentially solve your problem. So those are the options when it comes to a glass cooktop. Okay, let's move on to the oven itself. So the oven itself, obviously covering it is not really a practical solution. So you're gonna have to kasher that oven. Again, with anything we're kashering, same story. Oh, I left out a very important detail. The sink and the countertops, you've got to let them sit for 24 hours. That's because you're kashering them with boiling water. And if you have any utensils, forks and spoons and knives and a kiddush cup or a metal spatula, a metal knife that you want to kasher for Passover, and you're going to dip it in boiling water, it's the exact same process. You scrub it clean, sits for 24 hours, you dip it in boiling water, and you're kosher for Passover pot. And while I'm at it, every year the Cincinnati Kosher puts on a pre-Passover fair, and they have on-site koshering going on with giant pots of boiling water, and you can bring stuff and get it koshered right then and there. So that's a convenient option that a lot of people take advantage of. This year, it's this coming Sunday. I believe it's 12:30 p.m. It's either going to be at CZE or at the date, at Cincinnati Hebrew Day in the gym. Okay. Your cooktop is being kashered with fire. When you're kashering with fire, you do not need to wait for 24 hours. You just do it. So that's the other important thing to be aware of. Okay, now we're on to the oven. So regarding our ovens, there's essentially two approaches. You're going to start the same way as always. You're going to scrub it clean. Well, no, not necessarily. You don't necessarily have to scrub it clean. There's something called self-clean. Now, self-clean, if you have a self-clean oven, the original self-clean was designed where the oven gets so hot that it will destroy any residue on any surface inside the oven. This oven gets dangerously hot. I think close to 1,000 degrees. I think most of them will lock before you initiate the self-clean, and it's got to run for a number of hours continuously when it does its self-clean cycle. And there's all types of warnings involved. You really are not supposed to leave your oven unattended because you could start a fire if you're not careful. And apparently most ovens, when they run on a self-clean cycle, it reaches such a high temperature that some of the materials in the cavity of the oven itself emit fumes which are dangerous for pets. So this is powerful stuff. if you're gonna run a self-clean cycle of that nature, your oven is clean. Your oven's kosher when you're done. Every drop of anything not kosher that was is absorbed into any of those walls was incinerated, destroyed, and your oven is 100% kosher when you're done. The one and only thing you've got to do is that gasket around the door of the oven, which is not exposed to the full fury of that heat. You got to get in there with a toothbrush and clean that out. That's it. Once you clean out that gasket, there's no crumbs stuck in there, and you run that self-clean, your oven is kosher when you're done. Now, most manufacturers, if not all, will tell you to remove the racks before you run the self-clean cycle. Typically, they're only concerned about discoloration. If you're not concerned about discoloration, you can leave them in, and they'll come out, they'll be kosher when you're done. If you are worried about that, then you got to kasher them a different way, as we'll explain in a minute. Now, an important disclaimer, an important warning is because of the dangers of self-clean, old-fashioned self-clean, and because of the fact that it does take a toll on the oven. And if you self-clean too many times, you will ruin your oven. Your oven will hurt the life of the oven. Manufacturers begin producing ovens with other features of self-clean, which is less intense. And what they tell you, what they call it, steam clean or aqua lift, different terminology. But essentially what they tell you to do is that pour some water in the bottom of your oven, and then you put it on this cycle and it cleans the oven. Now, really all that's happening is it gets very hot, but not nearly the inferno of the original old-fashioned self-clean. It causes all the water that you pour in the bottom to come to a boil, and it gets everything very damp and very moist, and it kind of melts away a lot of the residue, and it just comes down and gets burnt up, and your oven is cleaner than it was before. Now, that's really not a koshering process because the residue is still in there. It's just getting moved, and it's not hitting a high enough temperature to completely destroy all the non-kosher in that oven. So that form of self-clean is not going to work to kosher oven. It's got to be the old-fashioned self-clean where it works through that extremely high temperature. Okay, now if you don't have a self-clean oven or you don't want to use the self-clean feature, you can kosher oven without that. It's just more work. So the first step is cleaning every surface, every last drop. You got to get all that residue off. If sometimes there's really stubborn spots on there, and some poskim will recommend use a caustic cleaner like Easy Off. And after 2 applications, if it's still not coming off, you can ignore it, because the poisons in the chemical gets absorbed into that food residue, and that itself renders it a kind of like a non-concern as far as the halachos of kosher are concerned. So that's the story there. So you got to clean the entire oven, get every last crumb, every last bit of residue completely out of that oven. And that includes the racks as well. And that could really be a big job. I picked up an interesting trick, which I've never tried, but Mrs. Burlov recommended if you spray them with Easy Off and put them in a garbage bag and leave them overnight, the power of the chemical sitting on that surface for a 24-hour overnight, everything just rinses right off. Again, never tried it, but If cleaning the oven racks is something that you dread, maybe you want to give that a shot. Okay, now that we have every surface completely clean, and again, of course, you're cleaning the gasket around the oven door, then you simply bring it up to the highest temperature it can go to, and you leave it running for 45 minutes. The 45-minute thing is not a halachic number. That's just to get, the idea is that all the surfaces and the racks are reaching that highest temperature it ever reached, high enough, and then after that, your oven is kosher and you can use it for Pesach. It is recommended, if you're not taking the self-clean option, you're taking the kind of just turning it up to the highest temperature, 45 minutes, that if you're cooking anything that produces any Passover food that produces a lot of steam, there are many poskim, there are many who are strict and recommend covering that when you're cooking it in that oven on Passover. If you did the self-clean, you don't have to worry about that at all. But there are many who do take that stringency, and that's a nice idea. One last thing I want to toss in there before we conclude is dental pieces. Obviously, if you have braces or Invisalign or any of that stuff, it's coming in contact with chametz over the course of the year. Can I use it on Pesach? And the simple answer is yes. You want to clean it as thoroughly as you possibly can. Certainly only use recommended cleaners. Don't use harsh chemicals and then put that in your mouth. That's not smart and not required. Clean it as best you can, and then you are good to go. You could use it over Passover. It does not need any actual kashering, because whatever food is in your mouth is not coming in contact with it in a way that could actually render it absorbed with chametz strongly enough to require proper kashering. One last practical piece of advice is timing. Timing when you are kashering for Passover is critical, and the reason is because you don't want to do anything twice. And you've got your non-Passover food you're eating before Passover, and then you've got your Passover food, which can't come in contact with your non-Passover food. It can't come in contact with unclean surfaces. So how do you deal with this? So a lot of people will start by cleaning their fridge and cleaning a cabinet. And then as they go shopping before Passover, they put their stuff there. And then they kind of stay away from it. And then they designate a time that they're going to turn over. That's the language that you'll hear a lot of people using. Turning over. I'm turning over my kitchen on Sunday. And you choose one day after the rest of the house is cleaned, and you've whittled away your chametz consumption, and you're ready to stop eating any chametz foods inside the house. And then you do it all in one day. And you scrub those counters and you cover them, you kasher the sink, the oven. You don't necessarily have to do the oven and the cooktop and everything on the same day. But the point I'm getting at is you want to designate a time where you're going to stop with anything that's not Passover food. You're going to put it all away, and you're going to create kosher for Passover spaces for your Passover food before you start bringing it out. That is really critical to time that all out, plan it well, so that you avoid all types of problems that you're going to run into if your Passover food and your Passover pots are brought out too early, and then they accidentally end up in your sink before you kashered it, or on your stove before you kashered it, or on your counter, which wasn't cleaned. That is a pre-Passover nightmare, and we've got enough work to do. You don't need any extra work. So make sure to plan ahead and to plan that out so that you have a strategy that's going to work well for your family. Once again, I want to wish you all a Chag Kasher Sameach. I want to thank you all for listening. I'll be sharing the recording later. If anyone wants it, please let me know so I can share it with them. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to stand for a few more minutes. I wish you all a wonderful night.